Hello and welcome to Mikey Learns. Today's October 14th, 2020. We'll be covering a Reddit post in the Microsoft Flow Reddit titled Question on Reviewing Approvals Sent via Power Automate. Simply put, the OP's question is how does the Power Automate approval log work? So we're going to jump on over to Flow real quick. Power Automate. Under action items, it's usually collapsed by default. There's a approvals option here. You have three headers: received, sent, history. Received are any approval flows that you've received. It's also a way of approving or rejecting them. Sent are any that you've sent. Now, if you're the creator of the approval workflow, then you're going to have quite a few sents. But you might not have so many received because you're not approving your own sent approvals. And then history is just kind of everything you're involved in. Now, the OP is kind of concerned with, I think if I remember right, kind of concerned with being able to track on the audit history of these approvals. This log works, but it's not really robust and it's limited to whatever Microsoft wants you to know about the approval. So, I mean, you can click on one and see the response and stuff, but inevitably or invariably, you could add a lot more metadata that's relevant to your business use case. So, and you might be saying, well, okay, well, how do I do that? Well, what I've always done is I've used SharePoint lists. You've got to be conscious of like list item thresholds and whatnot. So, as part of your project's requirements gathering, you're going to want to speculate total item count over time and evaluate whether a SharePoint list is capable of handling the amount of data you're going to be using or generating, because you may want to step up to a more traditional database like SQL or something. SharePoint list is probably sufficient for most use cases though, so especially for the sake of a demo, we're just going to use a SharePoint list today. So I'm going to jump over to SharePoint real quick, show you a very minimalist SharePoint list you could use. We've got a list called approvals on a site called approvals. Down here I've got some columns I've pre-created in advance of the video. Now, most approvals are the approval of a document, and so using a list is a way of both tracking all the metadata as well as storing the attachment itself that needs approval. With a list, though, you're going to want to make sure that list attachments are enabled. You can check the advanced settings for that setting. Moving on to the columns. I've got, like I said, bare bones columns here, but we're going to need an overall status approval, which in my case is a choice field, default value pending. Then there's also the values of approve and reject. Then we're going to have approver 1 metadata to include approver 1 status, which is down here. Similarly, or additionally, we're going to have approver 2 stuff. My example today is going to be a 2 approver situation. We might want to track the start date of when the approval was initiated. This is actually the created field renamed to start date. Then we might want to know who the requester is. The best way to capture that, especially if the requester is submitting the request themselves directly to the SharePoint list, is just to rename the created by field to, say, requester. So that's what this field is. Another limitation to be conscious of when you're gathering requirements for your project is, I believe the magic number is 9. If a list has more than 9, I think it's 9. You could Google it real quick. More than 9 person or group columns, then Flow can't talk with the list. It's just a hard limitation. As far as I know, it's 9. Now, the default created by and modified by fields, they're both person or group columns, which are these 2 columns here. Created by being renamed a requester. These take up 2 of those 9 slots of possible people picker fields. So the reality is you can actually only have 7 other person or group columns. In my example, I have 2, approver 1 and approver 2 columns. But just be conscious of that hard limitation as well. Moving on over to Power Automate, though. Well, actually, you may want to inevitably, well, you could use Power BI to display to have a visual representation of the approval process that's going on. More simply, though, you could just modify the view. So you might want to modify your view to be more appropriate looking based on like what kind the approval process itself. So, overall request data is over here on the far left, then we got approver 1 stuff, approver 2 stuff, and then the attachment itself. So you do this however you want. One recommendation before we move into Power Automate actually would be you might want to edit the edit form that comes default on the SharePoint list with Power Apps. The requester is not going to care about most of these fields. In fact, the requester may only need to fill in who the approvers are. So approver 1 and approver 2, if approver 2 even exists. And they're going to want to attach the file that needs approval. Everything else should be fields that they should not be able to actually edit because that's metadata that's being tracked via those approvers, via the approval process. So we wouldn't want the requester to muddy the water on those metadata values. So just a recommendation there. Moving on over to Flow, though, we're going to go into the flow that I've already pre-created. Like I said, this is going to be a 2 approver situation, or scenario rather, trigger being when an item is created. Then we need to tell Flow, for this particular triggered flow, we need to know how many approvers there are. Because if it's 1 approver versus 2 approvers, well, 2 approvers are going to have twice as many steps because you have to do the same steps for approver 1 as approver 2. So how I did it with just a 2 approver situation, you can just use a simple condition. Is there a value in the approver 2 field on the SharePoint list or not? So is approver 2 display name equal to null? If so, meaning it's empty, then that means, or rather it assumes that it's a single approver situation. So this condition would be true if it was a 1 approver, therefore it goes down to yes. If it's not null, meaning there's a value there, like a display name does exist, then it's going to go down this no side, and it assumes that it's a 2 approver situation. So I'm going to show you 1 approval for 1 given approver. It's just quite literally mirrored a total of 3 times. So, over here we're on the assumed to be 1 approver side. We start and wait for an approval. The approval type does not matter so long as the assigned to field has 1 person. If this is a group or multiple people, then the approval type does matter depending on your project's requirements. Title is essentially the subject line. Details is essentially the body. By default, it'll show Markdown supported here in the details hint text. So if you go online and search Markdown, Microsoft, there's an official Markdown document. For example here, 1 hashtag is header 1, 3 is header 3, 2 italics is bold, 1 italic is italicized, 1 asterisk is italicized. Link to item. This is kind of like the view form for the list item that's being approved. This trigger item here. Next, we want to know if approver 1 approved or rejected. Because this whole side of the condition is assuming 1 approver, we can also make some other assumptions, which I'll cover here. All right, so outcome is the dynamic. I'll cover them in a second. Outcome is the dynamic value coming from start and wait for an approval that determines approve or reject. So if outcome is equal to approve, then that assumes that this approval workflow overall is approved because it's a 1 approver situation. So we can assume that the overall value should be approved, as well as approver 1 status should be approved. There are comments. This dynamic value comes from here, and this is just a date expression that I pulled up offline. I'll throw this in the comments. This side assumes rejected, so their overall status is reject, approver 1 status is reject, comments and date are the same. One thing I didn't add in is the fact that you should probably, at the end of any approval, whether it be approve or reject, when it comes to an end, you should send an email or do something that alerts the requester. So on this side, you should have an email that lets the requester know it's approved, and over here it should be, hey, your request was rejected. All right, so I'm going to collapse all this, and I'm going to go over here and skim through this really quick because it's quite literally a copy and paste. I'll show you the differences though. So this is just approver 1 once again, because now it's a 2 approver, but we need to go through approver 1 first. Also, there's an assumption that if approver 1 rejects, then it does not go to approver 2. That's another assumption in this example. So we go to approve 1, approve or reject. Outcome is it equal to approve? If so, here's a difference from the other side. We're going to leave the overall status still as pending because it's got to go to approver 2 for approval. But approver 1 status is approve. So that's one difference. Over here on the reject side, though, if outcome is not equal to approve, we can assume a rejection. And in my situation, the overall status is going to get rejected, and it's not going to go to approver 2. So rejected, reject, comments, timestamp. We're going to send an email to the requester saying it's been rejected, and we're going to terminate the flow. Going back up, though, if outcome is equal to approve, we update the item with the approver 1's metadata, and now we go to start main approval again. Now all the dynamic values are associated with approver 2. So this is approver 2 email. Once again, copy and paste. Outcome is it equal to approve or not? Because this is the last possible approver, we can assume that the overall status should be equal to their selection. So in the case of approve, the overall status is approve. And this should actually be nothing. This should be blank, which will retain the value that's updated up here from above. I don't know why I did that. Same with this. So now we're updating approver 2 status to be approved or rejected accordingly. And we're going to send an email that's appropriate as well. Your request has been approved or it's been rejected. And then the flow ends. So that's as simple as it gets. It's a pretty bare bones flow. Now you could use switch cases as well to determine the number of approvers way up here. And for each switch, use like say a variable and set the variable to a numerical value equal to the number of approvers. And then have a switch case equal to 1, 2, 3, equal to the corresponding number of approvers. And each switch case is essentially like this would be, say, switch case 1, this would be switch case 2, and all these actions, etc. Another advanced functionality you could do is have a branch. A branch where on one side of the branch is the approval itself, so like these steps here. And then on the other side of the branch is a loop. And it's a loop that checks on a set interval, like say every hour or 2 hours, to see if the current approver's status is something other than pending, meaning approved or rejected. Why you might want to do that is if it's an issue where your approval individuals aren't responding in a timely manner, you could set up some interval loop that every hour it checks to see if they've rejected or approved. And if the corresponding approver status is still equal to pending, then it assumes they haven't responded. Therefore, you could send them an email, say every 24th interval, which would be every 24th hour, which is every day. You could send them an email, hey, you have an outstanding approval, please go check it out. There's a lot of capabilities that aren't demonstrated here. I have no problem helping with those. If you want to leave a comment asking how to do something, or you have a unique requirement that you want to talk about, then just leave a comment below. Thanks and have a great day.